If you were to run Graz'zt or Zuggtmoy, how would you portray them? For example, how would you set them up as the villain? What would you make them do, or how would they act? Interestingly enough, I have run both Graz'zt and Zuggtmoy as primary antagonists for my D&D campaigns. As for Graz'zt, he's the demon prince of decadence and desire, while also once being a devil. So when I run Graz'zt, I have him be a little bit more fiendish and understandable for the players. While demons are always chaotic and crazy, Graz'zt has this veneer of potentially being normal. But all of this is just a ruse, as Graz'zt is the lord of self-indulgence and corruption. I like to think of him as the prototypical devil on your shoulder, leading you towards that path of darkness. Graz'zt looks so nice, is entertaining, is charming, but underneath it all he is still a demon lord who is vile and evil. More palatable than most, yes, but still a demon lord. So when I ran Graz'zt as the primary antagonist, he was constantly reaching out to party members. Graz'zt was talking to them, offering them deals. Sometimes Graz'zt would offer deals or information that would directly lead to the defeat of Graz'zt's lieutenants. And the party was so confused like this, why was Graz'zt helping him? Isn't he the enemy? And some of them started thinking, oh no, we have it all wrong. Graz'zt is our friend, he's the good guy. And that's how he gets you. Demons and devils are limited by their fiendish nature. Demons are naturally chaotic and wild. Devils are limited by contracts and law, but a strong adventurer from the prime material plane can go across both alignments. Graz'zt would much prefer a level 20 adventurer as his lieutenant. I mean, yeah, having a Baylor is nice, but have you seen what that sorcerer can do with their meta magic? And how easily they can walk back and forth between planes and dimensions? So with that in mind, Graz'zt slowly started to try and orchestrate the fall of the party members. Not only did he help them on their missions, but he gave them lavish vacations, helped out friendly NPCs where he could, and generally seemed like a swell fellow. 3/4 of the way through the campaign though, Graz'zt sprung his trap. The party had a chance to join him and bring him into the prime material, or to stop Graz'zt himself from moving into the prime material temporarily, but demons were going to attack them and swarm them. The party in that moment realized that Graz'zt had orchestrated all of this in an attempt to bring them over to his side. So they rejected the Dark Prince, and the Dark Prince's demons destroyed their home base. The party barely made it out with their lives, and they lost a lot of friendly NPCs. But that is the insidious nature of something like Graz'zt. So I would suggest running him as this master manipulator. Someone who the party might think of as a friend or an ally. They might be able to go to Graz'zt for help or get magic items from him. But all the while, this is his plan, plain and simple. Graz'zt, I believe, is characterized by his selfishness and desire for power, and the corruption that he spreads to mortals. That is all hidden behind a guise of a charming prince. Zuggtmoy, on the other hand, is a completely different story. So this is funny because I began to run my Zuggtmoy campaign right before COVID started. The campaign began in January of 2020, and during the height of COVID, my players were fighting this living disease. Because I think that's best what Zuggtmoy is, this pestilence that spreads throughout the land. She is fungal in nature, and I think the best way to think about her really is the Cordyceps Queen. She is the villain of The Last of Us in a fantasy setting. Her spores spread throughout planes, taking over the minds and bodies of those that she touches. Zuggtmoy is a corrupting force, and not really a villain, more so I like to play her as this force of nature. You're not just fighting Zuggtmoy, you are fighting her disease. You're fighting the fungus that she spreads, and this also means you're fighting the land itself, the animals, and perhaps even the people. I think Zuggtmoy makes such a great D&D villain because her entire plan is to just sit back and let her disease spread. Eventually, the entire plane is going to be corrupted by her spores. So as a DM, you just have to know where the spores are spreading next, and what possible lieutenants of Zuggtmoy are up to. But really, time is the greatest enemy of the party, since eventually the spores are going to get into everything and everybody. This forces your players to take an active role in defeating the villain. If the party does nothing, if they ignore the main quest, then Zuggtmoy is going to win. And really, letting players solve these situations and campaign villains creatively is one of the greatest joys that I find while playing D&D and other TTRPGs. Another tiny thing as well that I think goes a long way, a Zuggtmoy campaign should never really end in a TPK, because Zuggtmoy and her followers don't necessarily want to kill you. They want to corrupt you with their spores. So minions and lieutenants of Zuggtmoy are always going to want to capture and bring you to places where they can infect you with spores. Maybe they can do that themselves, or maybe they need to go somewhere else to actually get the spores needed to corrupt the party members. But that gives the party time to escape and to keep playing. But at the end of the day, it leaves room for the campaign to keep on going. So for me, Zuggtmoy is a force of nature and a perfect villain for a sandbox campaign. She is off doing her own thing, corrupting portions of the map and allowing the players to figure out how to beat her. And of course, Graz'zt being that master manipulator. But again, this is how I ran these demon princes. And if you have a more interesting take on these characters or another concept that would work better in your particular campaign, then of course, use that. Next question though, from Dylan B. Fishkeeper, and this was a very, very long comment, but it essentially boiled down to a new player is best introduced with a Battlemaster fighter or a barbarian. And this was left on my champion subclass video. Now for me personally, I think that the best new player class is the rogue. It's extremely simple and easy to use, lets you roll really high numbers, and has a clear role within the party. But barbarians are also great. It's really hard to play a not functioning barbarian. However, I heavily disagree with introducing new players to the Battlemaster fighter, because a lot of people who play D&D are not wargamers, they're not strategic masterminds, they're just people who want to hang out with their friends. So when I'm recommending something like a champion fighter, and then you turn around and say, no, this Battlemaster here, with all of these different features is way better. Okay, yes, I absolutely agree, but that is still too many features, too many words for a lot of players, especially for some people who are new to the game. And that's not to say that Champion is the perfect subclass, it's not. I think that it is much weaker than it needs to be, but it's not so egregiously bad that you cannot have fun with the character. And the simplicity of the Champion is what brings people to it. And I've heard some people say, well, the Battlemaster isn't that complicated. Yes, for some players, it absolutely is. I'm going to need you to think a little outside yourself for a second. Consider people with mental disabilities. Consider young children, or people who are playing in their second language. These people deserve a subclass that is not complicated whatsoever. I mean, just look at all the Battlemaster has to offer. And you might say, well, it's not that complicated once you really start reading through it. But the wall of text is intimidating for some players. But even still, I think that the Battlemaster is a complicated subclass. I have had so many players over the years who I think would give some D&D fans heart attacks. I had a druid player who did not take any new spells past 4th level from the time they were level 9 until I finally caught it when they were level 16. For months they had no 5th level spells, 6th level spells, 7th level spells, or 8th level spells. They had those spell slots, but they never prepared any new spells. And it is these types of players that the champion is made for. Or players who just want a simple character. They don't care about power. They don't care that these features aren't actually that hard when you look at what they do. They want a character that is simple with as few words as possible on the actual page. So I'm always very confused when other DMs and players are recommending these actually very complex subclasses in the place of the simple one. Now, with all this being said, could Champion use a buff? Yeah, I believe so. I've said it many times that I have my own version of the Champion subclass, and it's buffed up a bit. But does that mean the subclass is unplayable? Absolutely not. This leads into another comment though, which is a commenter making the point that in the video, I make it sound like being weak and being simple were some sort of trade-off, where to be simple you had to be weak. And this isn't necessarily true. I don't think a class or a subclass needs to be weak for it to be simple, but I think it should be close to average. This is my personal preference, but I think it makes sense for the most complicated classes and subclasses to be the most powerful, and for the simpler ones to be closer to average. If a player puts in the time and energy and dedication to learn a complicated character sheet, to make the optimal plays and to keep up with their character, yeah, I think that they should be more powerful. They are running a more complex character, and that's the reward. The character has a higher ceiling, but ideally a lower floor. And that's kind of my design philosophy. The more simple the character, the higher the floor and the lower the ceiling. Your character is never going to suck, but they're never going to reach those high heights that other characters can reach. On the other hand, if you're playing a class like a druid, and you have no idea what you're doing, you're going to feel horribly underpowered and borderline useless. You are just going to be worse than everybody else. Now, if you know how to play the Druid class, I don't think there's any higher heights you can reach in 5th edition. That is a level of versatility and power that I think only the Bard class really challenges. But I'm okay with those two classes being so powerful because they require a deeper understanding of the game and its mechanics. So should a simple character be weak? I don't think so. But on the flip side, they shouldn't be powerful. I would never want to see a champion fighter be the top subclass the fighter has. Not even the top 3, not even the top 5. Ideally, I want to see the subclass towards the bottom half for it to be this floor that the class has. That's why I talk about it being this benchmark subclass. If you want a better subclass, there are so many more out there. If you're concerned about a subclass's overall power level and how it interacts with the game, especially compared to other fighter subclasses, guess what? You've grown out of being a champion fighter. It is not made for you. And I'm talking about this because I think it's important to recommend new players these simpler subclasses. This is how I successfully onboard a lot of people into TTRPGs. You give them the simple one, and once they master the simple one, you progress them to more and more complex characters. Maybe they want to switch the subclass mid-campaign, and if that's true, then who cares? Move them to a battle master, move them to a cavalier or a samurai. But don't throw them into the deep end and say, it's okay, there's a treasure chest at the bottom. If they drown in the pool, it doesn't matter. So I think this is why, for instance, that the champion or the thief or the circle of the land is a little bit weaker. And they all should be. Every class has its basic subclass. And just because the subclass is basic and it's not as powerful as all the other ones, doesn't mean it shouldn't be recommended. It certainly doesn't mean that they shouldn't be played. In fact, those are the subclasses that should actually be played the most, because you are onboarding new people with them. And that's partially why I recommend a champion fighter over the barbarian, because what is the barbarian's simple subclass? Yeah, it's the berserker, and the berserker fucking sucks. And I don't want to call out this commenter because I just went on a complete tangent. And I think that they would probably agree that the most simple subclass shouldn't be the best or anywhere near the top. This was more so a way for me to transition into talking about these simpler subclasses and the functions that they serve. Let's see, next up though, we hear time and time again about DM prep. What should players prep? This is a fantastic question because I do think players should prep, but many players don't know how to prep. So here's a checklist of 4 things you can do before a session starts. This is like your player prep. Number 1, look over your notes of what happened last game. Just remembering what happened and being caught up, understanding where the plot is and where the characters are is going to help your dungeon master tremendously. Secondly, create a goal for that session. The goal can be plot-oriented, like completing a quest, or it can be roleplay-oriented, like, man, I want to talk to this other player's character because the last few sessions they've been rather quiet and haven't gotten a chance to shine, so I as a player want to help them out. Setting a goal for yourself before the session can help you a lot. It can focus you, and if your party doesn't know what to do next, you can say, hey, I have this thing that I want to accomplish. And you can help guide the other players into doing something, and helping the session continue forward in earnest. Third thing you can do is have a few questions prepped for your dungeon master. They can be about the campaign world, certain NPCs, or just how they prep the game. And I say this because I'll let you in on a little secret. Every dungeon master I've ever met wants to be asked questions from their players. They want to be asked about these NPCs. They want to be asked on the world that they spent so long working on. They want you to say, wow, that encounter was so cool. How did you come up with that? So just having a question or two that you can ask before, during, or after the session might really brighten up your DM's day and make them feel like they're doing a great job. And the fourth one is if you're playing in person, and if you're financially able. Bring drinks, bring snacks, bring plates, bring something. If your dungeon master or another player is hosting a live session in person, that requires a little bit of extra work on their part. So bringing something to the session is always just a nice thing to do. So those are 4 things you can do. Notes, goals, questions, food. Prep those 4 things and you're going to be leagues ahead of other players at your table. Next question though from CyberRift, how would you fix the Ranger, or do you think it even needs fixing? This is a great question because even back when people were calling the Ranger the worst class in all of D&D, I still said that it was completely playable. And it was the worst, and it was playable. You could still have a lot of fun playing a Ranger. Because despite the reactionary opinions of the D&D community, D&D 5th edition is actually a very well balanced game. As someone who has played a lot of other TTRPGs, you are going to rarely find a character that can completely outshine everyone else in the party. And the Ranger before Tasha's Cauldron of Everything wasn't bad in combat. It had comparable damage numbers to a Barbarian, but at range, and it had some spell casting. The problem was that the spells that the Ranger had access to weren't very good, and most of its spell slots were taken up by Hunter's Mark, because you had to be casting Hunter's Mark to get the most damage you could in combat. And its first few class abilities you never really used. Or in my case, my Rangers used them all the time, but that's because I catered my game when a Ranger was in the group. New Dungeon Masters, when 5th edition came out, didn't understand they had to tailor the game to exploration when they had a Ranger in the party. So many Ranger features just went unused. But now in 2023, after Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, where the Ranger got buffed and updated, the Ranger isn't anywhere close to being the worst class in D&D. In fact, I think the Ranger is one of the most balanced classes in 5th edition right now. It's really hard to play a bad Ranger. You gain above average fighting ability at both melee range and at long range while having utility spells to back you up. And this is on top of having a really great slate of subclasses to choose from. Subclasses like the Gloomstalker, or the Swarmkeeper, or the Drake Warden are so flavorful and fun to use. Even their basic subclass, the Hunter, is really flavorful and effective to use. Wizards of the Coast has even updated the Beastmaster to make it more than playable in today's game. So honestly, Cyber Rift, I would not even touch the Ranger. And this comment was left on my Arcane Archer video. The Arcane Archer is not the move. My Why You Should Play series is more positive when it comes to reviewing subclasses, but out of that positive sphere where I'm hyping up every subclass, yeah, the Arcane Archer is dog shit. I would not touch that thing unhomebrewed with a 10-foot pole. That whole subclass is whack and an absolute trap for people wanting to play a ranged character. Now, maybe Ranger isn't the vibe for you and you're not really looking for that, and you're actually trying to play a fighter, and if that's the case, then the Samurai or the Battlemaster are much better archers than the actual Arcane Archer. Maybe if you wanted to, you could go Ranger and multi-class into the Arcane Archer if you just wanted a few arcane shots, but I really don't like the Arcane Archer, and when I'm playing games at home, I try and steer players as far as I can away from it. And again, for those Arcane Archer fans out there, you can still have fun playing it, I'm sure. But for me, I just think that literally any other option is better. So, long story short, I don't think the Ranger needs fixing. I think right now in 2023, it's perfect where it is. I think it's the Ranger and probably the Wizard that are in the best spots right now, at least in terms of balance. Next question though, would you be willing to go into further detail for the web and nodes? Perhaps tips on natural progression getting further to the center node, tips for multiple points leading to a single point, whatever insight you can give there. Thanks. And this comment was from my Fixing Your D&D Plots video. In that video, I lay out my node system of planning. And shortly after the video, I realized, man, I did not go into enough detail on this video. Or at least you guys wanted more detail and to actually see the nodes walked through. So I'm gonna do that. I'm actually going to sit down with the characters from a previous campaign and construct a whole new node system based off those backstories. So then I can show you how it works. So I definitely have plans to go into more detail with that particular aspect. But also I want to say here that I found it very interesting how much pushback there was from people against this central node, or the very concept that you would build your campaign around something. I'm genuinely really curious about these comments. In every campaign I've been in or I've run, there has been a reason to start this campaign. Whether it be this central plot in a module or a DM sitting down and telling us the players, hey, the Krakens are rising out of the ocean and you guys have to go and stop them. And that's the central conceit of the campaign. Or in a sandbox campaign, all of you are on the run from the law and meet each other in a tavern. But there's always a sense of something that makes this campaign different from other campaigns. I'm curious to know if you guys have had the same experience, or how many dungeon masters out there legitimately start campaigns where the party meets in a tavern, You have an initial quest and then nothing else after that, or nothing else happening in the campaign world or setting to differentiate it. Now, personally, I would think that those campaigns don't have plots. Now, that's not to say that you're not going through an adventure together and things are happening to your characters, but when I talk about plot, I mean something incredibly specific. It is the progression through a story, not a jumble of random events. Because without this central tension or central conceit, you are just ping-ponging through a campaign world. Things happen to you, but I would not call it a story. Maybe you would, but I would not. In the same way that I would not call an entire season of a sitcom a story. There are individual stories per serialized episode, but the whole thing is not a story. There's not a plot going through it. In fact, the plot comes episode to episode, but even then, in a D&D campaign, you're not going to plot an individual session to make sure it is this self-contained story. You can't possibly do that. So what I'm imagining is this random string of adventures that are fun and entertaining, and if that's your style of play, look, no harm done. But that D&D campaign doesn't have a plot. There is no central through line going through the story. So as I've been reading those comments, it's been interesting to think about how many of these D&D campaigns really do have a plot. Because random unlinked events aren't plot, they're barely even a story, or they are a story in hindsight. Yes, you might have great moments in a campaign where a bunch of exciting things happen, but a few great moments don't make a story. Look at the entire DCEU. Great moments in those movies, I will not deny it, but God, they have some terrible stories. That is something I've been genuinely thinking about. How to tell people that their D&D campaign doesn't have a plot, and what the reaction to that would be. Because I think some players would embrace that, while others might get a little frustrated and mad. Personally, I think it all comes down to game style and what you want from the game. That video was targeted at people that want a plot in their D&D campaign. I mean, just look at the title of the video. I know for me, as a player, I want a story within the campaign that I am playing. Having fun and goofing off with people is nice, but there are other mediums to do that with that don't require 2 to 5 hours every single week. I stay in campaigns for the collective storytelling that me and my friends engage with. But storytelling requires this central point for your plot and your characters to revolve around. And if they don't, well, have you ever watched a film student's first film? I'm friends with a few film students, and good lord, their first films had no plot. A lot of beautiful images and shots, no plot though. The story's not turning around anything. Now, I also think it's important to recognize that having a central node and having a connected story isn't railroading. I saw one comment saying it's railroading by points. Because, if everything is connected, then of course the players are going to go down the exact same paths. And that's just not true. Run the same pre-written campaign twice, and then come back and talk to me, because likely the experiences you'll have in those two campaigns will be different. Players come and they add something to the story. Once I ran the same homebrew campaign for 2 groups of players. They were like in parallel worlds. All the starting conditions of the campaigns were the same, and they were all linked up the same way with the web. However, the campaigns both ended up extremely differently. They went to completely opposite corners of the map. They fought completely different bosses, met completely different NPCs, or had radically different relationships with the shared NPCs that they met. Having a plot to your D&D campaign doesn't mean that your campaign is on rails. It means you know how aspects of your D&D campaign are connected to each other. You facilitated those connections while prepping for your D&D campaign. And you know how information, locations, and NPCs flow into each other. But the way the campaign progresses and how players react, that's up to them. And hopefully this is going to make more sense when I actually take you through prepping using this node system, or rather visualizing a campaign in terms of nodes. But I want to make clear that whenever I'm giving storytelling advice or campaign prep advice, it always comes with the caveat of don't railroad your players. At the end of the day, if your players do something that you're not expecting, you roll with that. But after all these years with certain players, I can kinda guess how a story is going to go based on how plot nodes interact and how players play. And so I can make an educated guess while prepping. Now, sometimes my guesses are wrong, but I'm not going to railroad the players into the one path that I prepped. We're just going to create a new path. And that's another thing about the plot web video that I wish I had made more explicit. Any part of the plot web can change. Even the central node. If your campaign radically changes into something new, so can the web. It is just a method of visualizing connections in your story. Maybe you thought the central node was going to be the villain, but it's actually a theme of found family. Well, we can reorient our entire plot web around this new node. We just have to redo some connections or shift things around. But it's not like anything is set in stone. How could it be in TTRPGs? The players control the story, and players are the most chaotic beasts on the face of the earth. Man, I've spent a long time rambling about this question, but my goal is to, yes, walk you through a more in-depth plot node video, much like my campaign arcs video. Ideally, we're going to go really in-depth about making these plot nodes and facilitating connections between them. That's going to be it for today, though. Next time, I'm thinking about going over the new UA and walking you guys through my thought process when I'm reviewing some subclass features. Not from the perspective of is it balanced or not, but how I would DM that character. How I would run a game so that that character and that player would have the best time possible. So let me know if you would like that to be a part of next week's GM 911. Check out the previous video if you have not seen it already, and thank you for entering the dungeon.